So to start, I've taken a video of all the tools I use for this project, and I'll cover them as I go through the actual project itself. But I want to use this time just to cover a couple points. First of all, disconnect your battery. If you don't do this, you'll ground out the horn, and that'll get kind of irritating. You're also going to want to turn on or turn your ignition switch back and forth when you're working with the steering wheel lock plate. So just to avoid any problems or any shorts, just disconnect the battery as you do this. I also show here some electrical tools. If you decide you don't want to put the new part through the steering column, you just want to send the wires through, you can always cut them and splice them at the other end. In this case, though, I was able to get it through with no issues, so these weren't necessary. Most importantly, though, what I'm going to be using here is a steering wheel removal kit with steering wheel lock plate removal tool there. And then, of course, we need our replacement turn signal switch part. In this case, it's the Crown Automotive part, but Omix Auto makes the same part as well. The first thing we have to do is remove the steering wheel. In this case, I have a Grant wheel on there, so I'm using a 5/32 hex tool to remove it. If you have a factory wheel or a different type of wheel, you might have to use something else. But in this case, this is how I started, as opposed to pulling the horn button. You'll also see that once I pulled this out, it was a nasty mess of wires inside. So once I was done, I went back and got that all fixed up. Next, what I'm going to do is use a 7/16 socket to loosen the 3 bolts outside of the main nut. After that, I'm going to use a pry bar and a 13/16 socket to remove the nut in the center of the steering wheel. What I'll do next is remove the remaining 7/16 bolts, and that will basically free up the adapter. At this point, what I'm going to do is take a hammer and chisel, and I'm going to mark the top of the steering shaft. Notice there's already a mark on the steering shaft, but I like to mark the top because I parked the truck straight, and that's where top is. After I remove the mount and the bell skirt, I'll make another mark at the same spot so that I can get this adapter back on in the same place it was. That way my steering wheel's not off center. Now what I'll do is I'll place the steering wheel removal tool in place. The only thing you have to keep in mind here is that you want the threads to match the bolts that came out of the adapter itself. These are aluminum, so they can be easily stripped out. Another important point here is you want to make sure you get those bolts in evenly so that when you tighten the center bolt down, it pulls out straight and doesn't bind or bend any of your bolts. Once that's done, I can use a socket to tighten the center bolt, which will put pressure on the adapter and slowly pull it off the steering shaft. In this case, it wasn't super tight. Sometimes they take a little bit of work and they'll want to pop off on you. Once that's off, we actually expose the steering wheel lock plate and the ring that we need to remove to actually get that off of the steering shaft. So what we do is we thread on the lock plate removal tool first, making sure to keep it up and down so that we have room to get in at that clip. In this case, my lock plate removal tool has seen some better days, and none of them that I've ever run into are very high quality, so I'm going to have to put a pair of locking pliers on this to twist it down as opposed to the standard wing nut that comes on it. They can also be really hard to turn, so you might want to keep in mind that you could use pliers for this. As we turn the wing nut, that is going to help compress this steering wheel lock plate, which will pull it out of the little channel that the ring sits in and allow us to get it out. As you can see here, it sits in not only a recess in the shaft, but also a recess in the lock plate itself. My preferred method of pulling these is to use a small pick and a screwdriver to get them off. Some can be loose. In this case, this was actually a pretty tight clip, so I had to fight it a little. Anything that takes a little longer in this video, I'm just speeding up for your convenience. Once you get that clip off and over the shaft, you can actually back off the tool, which will allow the lock plate to come out under the pressure of the spring below it. Next, we can just remove the tool from the steering shaft itself. The next time we use this will actually be to reassemble everything. This little clip is critical, so make sure you pull that off and put it in a safe place. Once you pull that off, you can remove the steering wheel lock plate. And if you take a look, you'll see the steering wheel lock plate is actually indexed. So taking it off and putting it on, you can't mess up where it goes on the steering shaft itself. It's going to only be able to go on in one direction. Taking a look here, we can see what function that actually performs. Looking at the back of the steering wheel lock plate, you'll see these little U cuts into it. When you turn your key all the way off and remove it, a pin comes out, and that's what actually locks the steering wheel. Underneath it is this little plastic piece that does two functions. That's actually your turn signal cancellation. There's two lobes on there that do that. And it also carries the electrical flow through to the horn button. And even though it does look hokey, you'll see that Grant's instructions actually say to extend this with a wire. So this was done correctly when they installed it. Here you can see why this piece is being replaced. As the plastic ages, it just gets old and brittle, and in this case it's broken. So actually moving the stock does nothing. So what we'll do first is we'll remove the stock with a number 2 Phillips screwdriver. And then we will remove the hazard button by grabbing it and turning it counterclockwise. The turn signal switch is held in place with 3 Phillips head screws, one on the left and one on the bottom there, and then there is one on the top. Sometimes you actually have to move the switch to get access to it. Next, I'm going to pull this spring. What's important to remember is if you're working on a tilt column, underneath this spring is actually a small set of bearings in a plastic sleeve. If you have this disassembled and you hit the tilt, there's a good chance you will blow those bearings out, and they are very tiny and hard to find. So once you start this process, do not tilt the column. Now we can remove the 3 Phillips head screws that are holding in the turn signal switch. Once the 3 screws are out, even though it is technically free, there's still a couple things we have to do to actually get it out of this column. So we have to go under the dash. Look under the dash, you'll actually see where the assembly plugs into the harness. I usually take a small screwdriver and pop up the plastic end that holds it into its clip. Once we do that, we get some free motion with it. But because I'm actually replacing the part, I'm not going to worry too much about getting a bunch of freedom of movement in it. I'm just going to take a look at my new part, make sure it matches up, the wires are the same color, and then I'm just going to take a pair of wire cutters and cut out the old wiring from the old turn signal switch. Once I do this, the turn signal switch isn't being held in by anything. So you'll see here, if I wiggle these wires at the bottom of the column, you can see the turn signal switch itself moving. One last thing, if you're pulling this out and you're still feeling resistance, it's because part of that switch sticks out the side of the column where the hazard switch goes. So if you gently press that in with your finger, you should be able to pull it out of the column with no issue. Now we can take a look and see the actual space that we have to put the new connector through in order to get the new turn signal switch installed. So I'm just going to turn the end of the connector sideways, and I'm going to start feeding it down through the column. Unfortunately, what is going to happen is it's going to turn sideways at some point and get wedged in the column. So for that reason, I just use a really long screwdriver. You could use anything as long as it fits in that slot, and I help work it down through the base of the column. Now what I can do is go back, pull up on the clip, pull out the old connector from the harness, and then I can insert the new one. They do tend to be pretty tight, just make sure you place it in the same place as the old connector and just rock it back and forth, and you should be able to get it to go in with no issue. The last thing I have to really worry about here is making sure that this sets in the way it's supposed to, so I'm going to make sure these wires are sitting flat so that they go into the column and they don't offer any resistance. I also don't want them to get pinched. And then I will gently place this into its spot, making sure that I'm lining up the holes and that it is fully placed into the column assembly. The first thing I like to do is put the hazard button back in place, because if I don't, I tend to forget to put it in. I'm then going to put the 3 Phillips head screws back in that secure the switch into place, and then I will reattach the turn signal stalk to the switch itself. Next, I'll put back in my spring, and I'll put back in the turn signal cancellation / horn button connector. Now I can place the lock plate back in position. I'll route the shaft of that cancellation part through it, and then I'm just going to find the spot where it sits in, because like I said earlier, it is keyed. Next thing I'll do, and it's very easy to forget this, is actually place the clip back over the assembly before I start compressing the wheel lock plate. We're doing exactly what we did before, but in this case I'm trying to compress that lock plate to the point where I can place that clip back into the recess. Once I've gotten the lock plate far enough down, I will press the clip into the recess, making sure that it's all the way in on all sides. Now I'll slowly back off the lock plate removal tool, and once I get to the point where it's even with the clip, I'm just going to double check that the clip is actually not only inside the steering shaft recess, but also the little recess for the lock plate itself. Now what I'll do is I will thread the horn wire through my adapter, making sure to use those marks that I made earlier with the chisel, line up so that my steering wheel is straight. You can also use paint for this, I just prefer a chisel, so it's harder to rub off. And then I'll place my bell / skirt where it needs to be. Next, I'll place the other piece of the adapter. I will thread the wire through, place it on top of our bell skirt thing, and then I will line up the holes so that I can start the 7/16 bolts that hold the adapter to itself. Once all the bolts are started, I'll get them all snugged down. With those snugged down, I will then place the center bolt back in, and using the pry bar and my 13/16 socket, tighten it down into the column. Now what I can do is I can replace the rubber skirt and reattach my steering wheel, and after this I ended up fixing the electrical issues. So if you're wondering where to get any of the tools or replacement parts, I have put links in the description. That way it's a little easier for you. I'm not an affiliate. I make no money off of it. I just think it's much easier and nicer to help people out with providing links to that stuff. So I hope this video was helpful, and thanks for watching.